This episode was brought to you by Pentester Academy, the leader in online cybersecurity education. Join over 10,000 professionals from 90 countries to learn security online. Also brought to you by Hacker Arsenal, artillery for cyber warriors. Visit us on hackerarsenal.com to check out our latest attack defense gadgets. I'm Marley Oxenholm from Pentester Academy TV, and welcome to our show, Access Point, where we spotlight cybersecurity companies and give an inside look at the people and technology behind the latest advancements in the industry. I'm joined today by Alex Bordei, who is Director of Product and Development at the company Bigstep. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to learn more about all the technical aspects of the company, so let's get started.
All right.
So now, what are the benefits of using bare metal as opposed to virtualization?
Oh, there's a huge difference, but it depends on what you're doing. So in different environments and different workloads has a bigger or smaller impact. So for instance, the traditional use for it is for web-based applications, like the traditional cloud providers. If you have a web infrastructure you want to host it, and virtualization makes perfect sense because you're mostly utilizing something like 10% of your resource consumption. But with big data, and then what that means is that you can have multiple machines overlap each other because, of course, the 90% of the CPU stays empty. So why not use it for something else, which drives costs down, which drives prices down, which means you can buy a virtual machine for cheaper than you would, just by using bare metal machines for doing the same thing. So it's just economics at play. But there are other workloads, like big data workloads in particular, where you use like 100% of the CPU, like 90% of the time, where you don't have that free space, so you are much better off just using bare metal. But that's not necessarily the reason why I have to use bare metal. The virtualization also comes with an overhead, which is negligible in web-based applications. Again, it makes a lot of sense. You have 90% of the CPU, you can use like 20% of it to compensate for the overhead that you have in virtualization. You're still fine. But if you use 100% of the CPU, then that overhead is lost to you. So the economics do not make sense anymore in this particular environment. So bare metal makes basically workloads finish like in half the time than they would in an equivalent VM-based technology. And it's also about context switching between multiple VMs. So if you have like N VMs and they have to get in and out of the context of the hypervisor, it adds to the latency. There's also big data applications that use multiple nodes in the same cluster, which means they have to talk to each other all the time. And networking is also done by a virtual switch rather than a physical switch and physical network card. And so that also uses CPU cycles. So it delays the computation overall. So again, it's about economics for a different kind of workload.
Okay. Is it safer to use one over the other?
It depends from where you come from. I would say that bare metal is safer than virtualization, mostly because the cloud provider has access to the hypervisor level and you only have access to the VM, which means from that point of view, you have to give up some control over your machine, right? So you have to trust the cloud provider that they won't get into your machine. Whereas the bare metal providers can give you the machine and you can log them out to some degree. So there's no virtualization layer, to provide that access. So from that point of view, again, bare metal might be better. There's also things like, Spectre and Meltdown that allowed, cross virtual machine access to some, theoretical level. And so, from that respect, it's safer. Now, if the virtual machine runs on your on-premise infrastructure, then it's yours, and it's, I think, safer in that situation.
100%, yeah.
Because you segregate that, let's say an attacker, if they get access to a virtual machine, they're constrained within that virtual machine. It's very hard for them to get out. And so it's a very good fence for constraining your attackers within particular area of the infrastructure. So they got access, but at least the damage that they can do is limited to that area.
Yeah.
From that point of view, having virtualization definitely helps over bare metal on physical infrastructures. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does. That makes sense. Thank you. Now, what are some of the challenges in automating bare metal?
It's far more complicated. It's one thing to talk to an API of hypervisor API, which is basically a software operating system, which poses APIs, and you talk to it and say, hey, boot up a machine for me, and with this amount of RAM and this amount of gigs. But bare metal, on the other hand, you need to talk to very low-level protocols that were designed to be able to do things like diskless booting, like the PXE protocol. So you got to be able to control that. You got to do, so what we did to control bare metal was to write from scratch, all our low-level protocol implementations like DHCP, DNS, TFTP, all that thing that, that array of technologies that were invented actually in the 90s, I think, or even prior to that. But we did it from scratch in order to allow the same level of flexibility with bare metal as we do with virtualization. Things like when a machine boots, it boots from a particular storage over iSCSI, and customers can say, drag and slide, I want to stop the machine after 5 minutes, and we turn it down, but we keep the hard drive, up and running, so that the customer can resume the work after a while, and just use it as a virtual machine, but with bare metal. And they can do things like, they say, I don't have enough RAM. They again select a different kind of configuration, and what happens is that the server shuts down and another server boots up and uses this the same hard drive with the operating system and customers' data to work. And so it's far more complicated, because this control, power control of the servers, and console access and provisioning, making sure that for instance, you erase hard drives when you get a machine from one customer to another customer. We do it through self-encrypting drives, so changing the encryption key of a drive. So it's much more work. I'm not saying building a hypervisor is easy. I'm saying that controlling bare metal to provide the same level of flexibility that a hypervisor provides is very, very complicated.
Yes, no, absolutely. That makes sense. I could see that. So now, I want to move on to the GDPR requirements, because I know that's coming up in a little bit. So I was wondering, can you summarize in an easy to understand, what companies, whether they're users of the cloud or cloud providers, will face with EU's GDPR requirements starting after May 25th?
That's a great question, actually. It's so, in a nutshell, if you use a cloud provider, and I think most of the companies out there use cloud providers to some degree. So, they use Google Analytics, they use Salesforce, they use, Gmail, perhaps, they use, Exchange, they use, like million different, SaaS kind of, services. So everything is basically cloud provider behind the scenes doing that. And it can be a first level cloud provider. So if you use a virtual machine from Amazon, then you have a direct relationship with your cloud provider. But if you use a SaaS, then you have a relationship with a third party that has a relationship with the cloud provider. So one way or another, you kind of end up at a cloud provider. So the problem for companies is they need to keep track of all these relationships, because if the data that they store in the machines or the services or everywhere is considered personal, and a lot of data is considered personal, it means that those cloud providers will be processors to the respective companies, right? Which means that you have to do due diligence when you choose them so as a company. So you cannot just say, I found out this, brand new, SaaS provider and does this and that, and it uses its own servers and it stores it in the garage somewhere, and I don't care, I like the service. And the problem is there's not, from a GDPR perspective, that's not obeying a principle called, privacy by design principle, which means you have to do your homework, you have to do your due diligence, and properly analyze the companies that you work with, because otherwise you're not protecting your customers, end users' personal data, which makes a lot of sense. Which means that you gotta analyze your service providers properly. And unfortunately, there's no universal GDPR type of certifications. It's something that says, you're 100% GDPR. Actually, there's not, because GDPR is not, it does not define like tiny checkboxes that you have to check. It defines a set of principles, and you got to obey the principles. And like the due diligence thing that I've been talking about, that's actually up to the company. So, for Bigstep, if Bigstep uses, let's say, Salesforce, right? Salesforce needs to do to prove that it is sufficient for me to trust them with my data is up to my company. So there's no like standard check, Salesforce has to be this and this and this and that.
Right.
No, it means it has to be enough for me. And so different companies will have different expectations. But I think that in time, it will converge to a sort of a ISO-like, set of requirements, which should be good enough. So again, it's a matter of principle. But at least it forces companies to think about whether their providers are good enough. And they have to mitigate the risk. They have to ask the companies the companies that you work with, hey, how do you, Mr. Salesforce, how do you protect my, emails?
Yeah.
Right? What do you do against rogue employees, for instance? Because I want to make sure that they don't run away with, all my millions of contacts, right? How do you do that? And they got to be able to answer that. They're forced, because if they don't, then I am not allowed to work with them. And
yes, exactly.
From my point of view, my due diligence says, I cannot work with them, even if they're, 100% US company. They gotta, if they want to do business in Europe, they have to do that. So it is up to me. And I think, this approach is a bit weird, but it's general enough to apply in most situations out there.
Yeah.
So this I think is the most important relationship or aspect related to working with SaaS companies and cloud companies. This due diligence process has to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you got to do your homework, because at the end of the day, you're the company. It's your company that's going to get penalized if you misstep. If you miss something, that's on you. So absolutely.
Absolutely.
So now, I know that much of the language around how to comply with GDPR seems focused on roles companies may play in terms of access to or management of user data. Could you share information on how companies can determine how to comply based on an understanding of the role that they play under GDPR?
All right. So assuming that companies understand what their role is within the relationship, because roles, a company can be processor and controller at the same time. So the role is based on a relationship. So that can be, Bigstep can be, a controller for its own data that comes from marketing channels, and a processor for all the other companies that store their big data with us, right? So you can be in multiple relationships. But assuming you're in a single relationship with your provider, and you're a controller, and you're working with the cloud provider and they're the processor, as I said before, you have to obey those principles. You have to be aware of them, like privacy by design, right to be forgotten, right of access, and all these principles coupled with a good analysis of the data that you store. So basically, take an Excel file, and somebody from your company has to take an Excel file, walk through the company's all data stores and data collection processes, and write down where it comes from, who has access, all that stuff, and where it goes, the retention period. From there, the technical aspects of obeying the principles, I think, can be easily solved, right? But the fundamental, most important thing is, again, doing your homework, right? So in your homework, in this case, means understanding the data that you collect. And we've been doing this GDPR analysis on our own internal GDPR audit, and you'd be amazed of how much data gets collected, even in a startup. It's just a lot of data, and GDPR at least forces you to think about those.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what obligations should data controllers expect their cloud providers to meet?
So as I said before, there's no standard GDPR compliance. It's not like SOC4 or ISO or anything like that. So it really depends on the company that asks that gets into this relationship, as I said before. However, and it's a risk management practice. So so you gotta think about, you have the data catalog that you've created earlier, that we spoke about earlier, and you get that, and each piece of personal data that you work with has some risks associated with it, and you think about the risks, and then obviously you gotta find ways of mitigating the risk for each risk that you've identified by basically asking your cloud provider or vendor or processor that you work with, how do you do this, or do you do that, or how do you do that? like, as I said, protecting against rogue attackers or protecting against technical security, encryption, and all that stuff. So that's one way of doing things.
Yeah.
And so there are various ways working with your cloud provider to protect some, but also you can do a few things on your own, like anonymizing data, pseudonymizing data at the source. So I would say that starting from the assumption that your cloud provider is unsafe, and putting only the data that you absolutely must put there is good. Anonymizing the data, which means basically the personal data characteristic of the data disappears. So it's a lot easier to store it. And a lot of our customers in big data do that because they only need, in fact, when you do statistical analysis of the data, they don't need personal data. They need only the statistical characteristics of the data set. So you can anonymize it. And even if you do need to track back to a particular customer or individual, you can pseudonymize it, which means replacing my name, Alex, with John Doe and using that. And it's good enough. I mean, there's a translation table somewhere safely stored in your organization. You can use that to do the reverse. So that definitely helps protect from the get-go. But there's also a series of ISO certificates that you can ask your cloud provider. So you say, hey, at least tell me, what sort of ISO certificates you have, because there's a little bit of overlap between ISO and GDPR to some degree. And also, if you have like ISO 27001, for instance, it means you've done some due diligence internal to some processes. So you can ask about it. It doesn't mean you're GDPR compliant if you have ISO. So it's far from that. But at least it helps you, expedite some questions. And what I assume is that most of the questions that you think about asking your cloud provider, the cloud provider already got them from others many, many times. And they would probably, if they don't already have it, they will probably set up this like huge Q&A kind of FAQ document on their website they can refer to and help you do that due diligence. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely. Now, I'm curious for the reasoning of everything. Why do you think that the GDPR will ultimately help users as well as companies to advance into the next technological era of data?
Oh, so that's, again, very good question. I think it's become apparent, with Cambridge Analytica and all, the recent scandals. And I've always been, personally, I've been very strong supporter for GDPR because I thought, even before Cambridge Analytica, all this stuff is there's so much power in companies, and with great power comes great responsibilities. But what's interesting is that power is not with the managers necessarily of those respective companies. It's with young data scientists, like 20-somethings that have this huge access to a lot of data. And that data is not just the fact that you can monitor somebody. The power is in situations where you can discriminate against certain categories of the population, like when you can keep certain areas like elderly people. If you have an algorithm that doesn't have enough data about the population, it might not act properly. Sorry.
It's okay.
Might not act properly against those because it doesn't have it. They're underrepresented in the data set. Or if a data set is based on observing humans and those are, let's say, have biased, I won't say racist necessarily, but they have certain biases. Algorithms and the models that get created through that are also biased. Right?
Very true.
Biased data sets, biased algorithms, racist algorithms. And so, there are a lot of situations where big data can be used for doing bad, even though you intend to do good with it. And so there's, again, a lot of responsibility, and there's not enough ethical training in big data. And so GDPR comes and it cannot talk about, what you use big data necessarily for, but it can restrict access to data, which is fundamental for doing big data. And so I think the problem is if you don't come with these sort of principles in the market, if companies don't adopt them, let's say if GDPR wouldn't exist, what would happen is that I would say that there's the distinct possibility that would have something like a technological hypochondria where people they start to get so afraid of what data people can collect about them, like the target with a pregnant woman, if you're familiar with that, that you might be afraid of using a lot of the online services. And I think like vulnerable segments of the population might be afraid of using those services. They're just afraid.
Mm-hmm. It almost forces the companies to act ethically at that point. You have to, yeah.
Yes. Because what's the other option? The other option for the society is to just lose those categories of the population. They just all together.
Yeah.
And so there's billions of dollars in opportunity costs by not properly addressing those. And so the fact that there is GDPR is going to save our economy a lot of money, and it will bring in different categories of the population. And I hope this is going to be at least from a mindset perspective a good thing that happened, because again it will force companies to adopt proper relationship towards their customers. And we've seen that companies have a lot of influence nowadays, and they need to take charge and they need to act on that power that they have and protect customers.
So now, in response to GDPR, what innovations has your team made?
So we've been focusing a lot on the ingest side. So just as a parenthesis, our company does a lot of big data pipelines, right? So data pipeline means that you get data from some systems and you put it in a data lake in the cloud, right? Which is a big giant repository of data that's unstructured. And GDPR says do privacy by design. And what we understand by that is that we need to protect the data as much as we can, which for me doesn't mean building a fence around the data. Of course, you got to do that as well. But primarily, storing the data that you need in a format that you can work with, by anonymizing the data at the source or pseudonymizing the data at the source, as we've talked about. And this is where we're, so we are trying to make it very, very easy for our customers to do that on their own at the source, in the company before they push data into the cloud, right? So at the other side of the pipe. And I think this is really important. I think ease of use because the tools, there's nothing new in the way you do, let's say, anonymization or pseudonymization. It does basic things, although anonymization can be actually very tricky. Another parenthesis, there's no such thing as 100% anonymized data, mostly because by correlating an anonymized data set with another data set, you can re-identify certain personal information. And there are various degrees in which you can do that. There are some famous examples about some governors' health data being leaked with an anonymized data set on the internet, and that was re-identified. But just parenthesis closed. So the companies should not assume that anonymized data is 100% safe, because it's not. But at least from GDPR's perspective, it's good enough. So this is where we're focusing on, making it very, very easy to use at a source, to give customers the tools to do this easy before they push data into the cloud. So they are as safe as possible. And we're trying to expand this ease of use paradigm across the board, which means that we wanted to make it very, very easy to manage firewalls. Right. So again, big data, you use clusters of machines. We have customers with hundreds of machines. And it's a lot harder to maintain like firewall across all the machines. You can put a firewall with front, which means perimeter defense. Perimeter defense is good, but what do you do if somebody gets in through one mean or another? So what we do is we try to maintain good proper access security policies across all machines. And people don't do that because it's hard. Right, so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it very, very easy to manage security across the entire cluster of data that you have through, which means managing VPN, managing again anonymization at the source. So basically, the entire pipe and all the elements that make up the pipeline. And it's actually very hard. It's very hard to do something easy.
Yeah, deal with the difficult part now, and so down the road it can be so much easier for the customer at that point. Absolutely.
Exactly. So, so I won't say necessarily these like hugely innovative things. I think it is a novel focus that not a lot of security product companies do, which is ease of use, focusing on ease of use. Well, I mean, we're not a security company, but these aspects of our cloud provider, which is our cloud, which is a self-service cloud, they need to be in this way in order for us to make sure that by design they can protect themselves, protect the data that they have, and because we've done an analysis at one point, another parenthesis, and I'm sorry about that. We've done an analysis where we wanted to see what happens to a survey if you put it out there in the internet. What happens? Just open it up and collect as much data about it as possible. Just as flow and network information about what the port scans and that sort of stuff. And what happens, and we've had a map at one point, is that in a couple of hours we had not attacks, but port scans at least, and SSH and access attempts, basic like knocking on the door and see if there's anybody at home from I think like 10 countries across the world. So like China, we had a lot from Brazil, we had a lot from India, we had a lot from Africa. It's just like we had the map of scans. So the internet really is the Badlands. So and we had in the beginning, before we did this sort of like very, very easy to manage firewall and very, very strict two-factor authentication, access mechanisms, and like hugely complicated SSH things and HTML SSH consoles, so that you don't have to open your SSH port within your on the firewall. Before we had that, we had customers getting hacked, not because the systems weren't safe, but because the passwords that we're using were not properly thought out. Because they won't say, "Oh, I put the password now," but and I kid you not, in a matter of hours they got hacked. So if you put a bad password today, now they can get hacked because there's state actors trying to do, and they're doing these scans, and they're doing. So you get like 500,000 of SSH passwords being checked, right, against your server, if you let it happen. And so from my point of view, fundamentally, you gotta help your customers help themselves. Make it as easy as possible for them. Give them the tools and assume they don't know what they're doing, and help them just be safe by default.
Yeah, absolutely. Some things they don't even know yet.
Security by default. But again, I'm not saying that what we do is state of the art. I'm not saying that although we're doing a very advanced analysis of the attacks that happen, because we do big data, we can do big data on security data as well. So we have, we analyze all the traffic that comes towards our network, and try to identify patterns on that and see if that's something anomalous happening. But anyway, that's not important. What's important is that we are trying to work with our customers, because the customers are key to security in the cloud. The cloud gives you a virtual machine or gives you a server, but you're ultimately responsible for maintaining security on that server, and you are the weakest link within this relationship.
Absolutely. Human error is always the number one. So definitely.
Yeah.
And so now, lastly, what future developments can we expect to see down the line from your team? What does the company roadmap look like?
So for us, one big development that we haven't talked about that much is the fact that we want to expand into be able to manage infrastructures on other cloud providers as well. So not just on our bare metal, but also on AWS and Azure and all the others. Because we've seen companies, we have a lot of companies saying, "Hey, I like you guys, you're great, but I also have a piece of my infrastructure somewhere else, and I want to keep that." So we believe that the future is multi-cloud and cross-cloud, and on-premise plus cloud and sort of hybrid, but all together at the sort of the same time. And so that's one direction in which we're moving, which basically is going to get this ease of use, into in managing big data, on other clouds as well, not just ours.
Very nice. I'm excited for that. That'll be really cool. Alex, thank you so much for talking with me today about all this. I appreciate it.
Likewise. It was very nice.
All right. Take care. And I look forward to seeing more from you guys in the future.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Also, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook so you don't miss out on any of the latest cybersecurity news. This episode is brought to you by Pentester Academy, the leader in online cybersecurity education. Join over 10,000 professionals from 90 countries to learn security online. Also brought to you by Hacker Arsenal, artillery for cyber warriors. Visit us on hackerarsenal.com to check out our latest attack defense gadgets. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.